Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very excited to bring the fascinating conversation I had with Paul Chaisty and Stephen Whitefield. Paul is a professor of Russian and East European politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations at the Oxford School of Global and Area Studies and at St. Antony's College, University of Oxford. He's the author of a handful of books, including the one he's co-authored with Stephen. That book is entitled How Russians Understand the New Russia, Consolidation and Contestation, which is what we talk about. Stephen is a professor of comparative Russian and East European politics in the Department of Politics and International Relations and a fellow in politics at Pembroke College, University of Oxford. And I talked to both of them about not just Russia, but how Russians view Russia at the present moment, looking at public opinion data. And we, of course, talk about how they have got access to that and their research. The book is very technical, but very clear and very precise. And so it's very easy to follow. It was an absolutely fascinating read. I really, really enjoyed reading the book, and it was even more of a privilege and delight to talk to both gentlemen. We start the conversation by talking about Russia's transformation since the fall of the Soviet Union. We talk about consolidation and contestation within Russia's hybrid political economy. We, of course, define those terms, and then we define this hybrid political economy Russia has. And then we talk about generational changes under Putin. He's been the leader there for 25 years. And, there's some generations that have, coming on. And so it's interesting to see some of the change there, especially after 2014 and certainly after 2022. We talk about authoritarianism and what that looks like in Russia, how they collected public data from Russia, changes in Russian public opinion, and the role of social media, propaganda, talk about how Russians vote, the aspect of identity in Russia, the Russia-Ukraine war, what a post-Putin Russia looks like, and many other topics. Again, very fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed how detailed it was. It wasn't this kind of surface level of things or opinion pieces per se kinds of things. It was very focused on the data, very technical in very good ways, and it's very enriching. I found the conversation, the book, and the conversation very enriching, and both gentlemen are just wonderful. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com. I'm also on YouTube, so please subscribe to the Substack, share with your friends. It always helps. And now I bring you Paul Chaisty and Stephen Whitefield. I'm here with Paul Chaisty and Stephen Whitefield. Gentlemen, thank you both for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Absolutely. You've written a fascinating book, which I really, really, really enjoyed. The book is called How Russians Understand the New Russia, Consolidation and Contestation. This is out through the wonderful Princeton University Press. So we're going to talk all about it. Before we do, why don't you both just tell us a snapshot of who you are? I guess, Paul, we can start with you.
So I'm a professor in Russian East European politics at the University of Oxford, and I'm also currently head of the School of Global and Area Studies. So I have two masters at Oxford University, the Department of Politics and International Relations, where Stephen is based, and the School of Global and Area Studies. And I specialize in Russian and post-Soviet politics.
Very nice. Stephen?
Well, I'm also in the Department of Politics and International Relations, also a professor of Russian and East European politics. I've been in Oxford since 1993, I guess even longer, since I was an undergraduate there and a graduate student. So I've been Oxford man and boy, as they say. And Paul and I have been working together for quite a number of years, publishing quite a few articles And we finally got round to finishing this book, which we're going to talk about today. So it was we've been a team for quite a while.
Yeah, that's really lovely to hear, actually, when you see people working together and when they do it for so long. Obviously, life happens, things happen personally in the world, and so to maintain a good kind of duo pair is very, very nice. We'll get into. I mean, I think the one of the interesting questions for me, and you talk about it in the book and things like that, that I'll that we'll get into is the data and how you got the information, public opinions, things like that. So we'll get into some of the weeds of that. But I guess before we do, I think obviously there's been some tough moments in the region for the Russian people and for their neighbors. Excuse me, for a handful of years, especially more recently since 2022, of course. We'll mention that as well at some point. But I guess just generally, we'll start kind of broad picture here. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, was it 91, 92, whatever it was, how has Russia been transformed politically, economically, and socially? And more specifically, what is the kind of, if you will, boots on the ground, this idea of where Russian people are kind of seeing this as best you can know. So less about politics or administrations or things like that, but more so from the public. So yeah, how's this transformation from early '90s, the fall, up till 2025 today?
Paul, do you want to have
Yeah, sure. I'll start with this. So, Russians have experienced sort of profound change to both the society that they live in and the political system that governs them and the economy that they they work within. If we go back to the 1980s, Russia was part of a system of total power, a totalitarian system, a communist system, where all aspects of life, the economic system, the social system, and the political system, were tightly bound together. So Russia had a command economy that was totally controlled by the state politically. It was governed by one party that operated within the parameters of one ideology. And socially, both the party and the economy exercised total control. That system, as we know, broke down in the late 1980s and early 1990s and was replaced by one that was, in principle at least, governed by a market economy, by a democratic political system, and socially a system that allowed for many rights and freedoms. And Russians at first were very sort of committed towards that system. Over time, that has changed. As we sort of moved into the 2000s, it was replaced by one that was more, once again, tightly controlled by the state, more authoritarian. I must also say that, that Soviet system was engaged in an ideological conflict with the West. That was replaced in the 1990s by a relationship that was far more cooperative. There was, generally speaking, a much more sort of pro-Western orientation in Russian foreign policy. We get into the 2000s, that changes once again. Anti-sort of Western attitudes grow. And, by the late 2000s, the system has become once again far more authoritarian, far more anti-Western. And at the mass level, attitudes have generally followed this pattern of development. Although what we find in the book and what we show in the book is that as the system becomes much more authoritarian in the late 2000s, divisions once again reopen over where Russia ought to be developing politically, socially, and economically.
I would agree. I just add a couple of things. The first is these are shocks, right? So these aren't easy things for people to take on board, right? So what happens is with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you get a shock to the economy that has dramatic effects on people's living standards and opens up a whole range of other sorts of divisions. You also get a novel political system. The third thing that's really crucial in our book, though, is that for the first time, there's something called a Russian state on new territory. And as it were, the collapse of the Soviet Union leads to a dramatic shift in what the sense of the territorial nature of the country is. And that's the third shock, right? You have to remember that people, particularly in Russia, during the Soviet period, right, often identified themselves as Soviet, more than they identified as Russians. And so the loss of that territory had profound shock to Russian public opinion as well. And so it's these three elements, the politics, the economics, the territorial, which come together and which we explore in detail in the book.
Yeah, as you both are saying there, I was thinking about how, it's interesting. There was a more tightly run, a bit more, at least in the Soviet Union, maybe more totalitarian. Now you have more authoritarian. It seems like there's this pull back to, okay, we had it one way for a while. That didn't, work. And then we tried to do it differently. And now we're going to regress in some ways back in the 2000s to something that has a more hierarchical structure. And along with these ideas of identity, I mean, of course, it has to be, Russia is got a long history, but if you had a Soviet Union, which incorporated much of Central Eurasia, and now you have Russia, granted, it's still a very large country, I can imagine that's a shift in terms of identity in a modern era. You could maybe talk about historical identity, sure, but in terms of a modern era as a modern state, that I can imagine is also a shift. So I guess to further push on this, I guess you both mention. Well, I guess it's the two big themes. I mean, they're the two big themes of how you guys, I guess, conceptualize these opinions here, and with the Russian people. You're talking about consolidation and contestation. And these are the two big themes of the book. I guess talk about those concepts within this hybrid political economy. I thought that this was a very interesting way in which you both presented it in the book of what, there's not a clear-cut way in which Russia has a certain type of economy or a political system. It's a hybrid. So maybe tell us about the hybrid and how you see consolidation and contestation working there.
Can I just say something else actually about what Stephen just said?
Yeah.
And it fits with what you're asking, Javier.
Mm-hmm.
So you're right. At the sort of state level, there is sort of a re-engagement, both sort of politically, also economically and socially, with aspects of the Soviet past. And in the book, we explore the impact of this. But that's at the level of practice. Yeah. Normatively, for a long time at least, both Russia's rulers and what we show in the book, Russian society, remain wedded to a very different set of ideals, which are about democracy, and the economy. And there is some evidence, so democracy and the free market economy. And there is some evidence, at least, that for at least the sort of first 15 years or so, there is a growing identification with this new territorial area, the Russian Federation. Although, as we also show, as the state sort of discourse around the nation changes, this once again is replaced by greater identification with the Soviet Union. And this sort of difference between what is being said, rhetorically at least, about these big norms, about democracy, about the free market, and what is happening in practice in terms of how the political system and the economy are being governed, the disconnect between those two things is what we mean by hybridity, right? So it's hybrid insofar as, at one level, there is a commitment to the norms of democracy and the free market, but in practice, we see something very different. That's how we interpret hybridity. And when it comes to consolidation, what we mean is that both the people who run Russia and the people who live there broadly accept this hybridity, broadly accept the rules of this system, both formally, which are reflected in these norms around democracy and the free market, and informally, i.e. the reality of how they are sort of implemented in practice, which are far removed from the ideals of democracy and the free market. Is that clear, Javier?
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, in some ways, we were kind of puzzled for a number of years about something that we expected to find in our data, but we didn't. So we asked people, what do you think about democracy as an ideal system for governing Russia, right? And we define democracy in a very kind of liberal way as, when political parties compete through elections to hold power, right? And we asked people about the market in a similar kind of way. And given some of the things that we know about how Russia has worked, particularly as it were, there's a trajectory of how Russian politics and the market have gone since 1991. We kind of expected that people who thought that democracy was an ideal form of government should basically hate the way it was being practiced, right? Because why would they not? But in practice, in fact, what we found was that it was actually very compatible, that people found it possible to like democracy as an ideal system, but also really like how democracy was working in Russia, right? And that was in part because the regime never gave up entirely on the legitimating claim that it was democratic. And it allowed for parties to compete. Of course, they were very constrained in how they could compete. And the regime certainly helped fix elections and control elections. But they never gave up on this notion that they were running kind of democracy that we could sort of see. And it's only then when the drama in this, if you like, right, comes when the regime starts overtly to abandon even the facade of claiming to be this democracy in a market, right? And it's when that starts to happen, right, which we actually date well before 2022. We think it starts probably to happen around after 2012. It's a kind of key moment in post-Soviet history, 2012, when the regime in different ways starts to shift. And I think it's kind of interesting, if you're interested, we could talk a little bit about why that happens, why the regime starts to shift. It's partly a response to the mass protests that take place, led in large part by Navalny, in 2011, 2012 against the electoral fraud.
Yeah.
It's also because Putin has to come back and replace Medvedev as president, and Putin then shifts in a kind of highly expansionist way that is really pushing back on the kind of normative basis on which the regime had supposedly been operating. And then, of course, the big move is in 2014 when they go into Crimea, the conflict starts in eastern Ukraine, and the break with the West becomes really quite intense. So it's coming back to consolidation and contestation. One might think that in a regime like Russia's, this hybrid regime, that people would be either pro-regime or anti-regime. And that would be the big division within Russian society and public opinion. But what we find for a prolonged period of time, while the regime is operating on this hybrid way, but remaining committed notionally and rhetorically to democracy in the market, we find that essentially the regime is uncontested, or this hybrid political system is uncontested. It's when they start to depart from this that contestation at the regime level, what sort of society people want to live in, reemerges. But one more point, if I can, I've been going on for too long.
No.
Because there can be contestation about the regime, it doesn't mean that you're either for the regime or pro-democracy and pro-market. Because what also emerges after 2012 is that you can be anti-regime and a full out-and-out authoritarian. So Paul and I wrote an article back in the day that studied support for the protests against the regime in 2011, 2012, which we called Forward to Democracy or Backwards to Authoritarianism. But what we discovered in our analysis then of those protests was that there were as many out-and-out authoritarians protesting against the regime as there were out-and-out Democrats protesting against the regime, right? So this is contestation, but the contestation is rather complex, right, when it emerges, and it leads the regime itself to move increasingly in, we think, an authoritarian direction.
Oh, it's very, very complex. That's very interesting. Okay, let's go back a little bit. I'm going to come back to more recent events, but after the fall of the Soviet Union, my understanding is Russia as a new, federated state or whatever was in a bad way. They were in a bad way economically. I mean, very, very, very impoverished, fractured systems, really tough. Financially, it was very, very, very difficult. In 2000, when Putin comes or is democratically elected, how much of that? Two things. How much of that is okay? We've had 10, 12 years, whatever it is, post Soviet Union. Things haven't been great, and how what's the push? Obviously Putin has had an evolution himself as well. 2000 Putin is not the same as 2012 Putin or 2025 Putin. So there's an evolution here in a sense, but how much of that at that time are Russian people saying we want this guy, we think it's right, and how much of that has staying power? Because more or less, aside from the intermission with Medvedev, Putin has been there. I mean, and he was, I guess, behind the curtain, I guess, for 25 years. So I'm coming on to the authoritarianism and how some people wanted it and some people didn't, even with people that are pro-authoritarian. I guess my question here on this is, knowing all the economics and the political structures that happened post-Soviet Union, how has there been for the way in which Putin has done things, again, up until, let's say, 2012, 2014, so much, I guess, in some sense, maybe not agreement, but willingness to go along with this and to keep him there for a while across generations. That's to me what is the most interesting thing. People born or people that were alive as adults in 91 are going to be a bit older now in 2025, and you're going to have at least one, if not two generations. You know, the current generation might be very young, but you're talking about this over 35 years. You know, a long time, and you're having people still say, "This is the guy, and we're going to do this." Now, you obviously have people that dissent, but yeah, tell us about that. What was the kind of historically coming out of the Soviet Union, impoverishment, political fracturing, okay, and then generationally, how people are, Russian people have said, well, I mean, they've said for 25 years, you know, Putin's going to be the person. How do we understand these things?
I mean, on how the system sustains itself, and why Putin is not sort of affected by generational divides, socioeconomic divides that are created by the transition from sort of communism to sort of hybridity, and all the social and economic changes that have occurred in the 2000s. What we argue in the book is that the system has ways of sort of mitigating those conflicts, which reinforces this sort of consolidation that we're describing. So it does that in a number of ways. Russia's electoral authoritarianism actually gives the regime a great advantage. And so elections, rather than presenting an opportunity for contestation and conflict, they actually provide an opportunity for the regime to sort of reassert its power. They provide many advantages to the regime in terms of the legitimation of its power. So that's why elections are so important. And so one thing that we show in the book is that the governing party in particular over time has become much more effective as a force to capture the full range of attitudes that exist in Russia towards the system. Yeah. So these anti-system authoritarians that Stephen was talking about a minute ago, they are actually more likely to vote for Putin. And it's true also for the anti-system market Democrats. They also become more likely to vote for Putin over time, up to a point. When Putin starts to mess around with Russian identity, then those divisions, as we argue in the book, re-emerge again. And this is why, we conclude by arguing that the end of hybridity is actually politically problematic for Putin, because hybridity provided many advantages for the system and for the consolidation of its power.
Yeah.
So elections are one way in which Putin personally is able to sort of mitigate any opposition towards his rule and towards the system that he created, but also the market economy and the way that it has been constructed. This is not a typical OECD economy, right? It's an economy where exchange occurs because of political connections, not because of economic efficiency. Yeah, so the political nature of the economy actually also gives the regime many advantages in terms of mitigating conflict. Yeah, so it limits the growth of interests within the system that could become the basis for contestation. So, I mean, maybe Stephen can talk a bit about what happens in the 90s and how Putin comes to power in the first place. But what I've just said is certainly an attempt to explain how the system then becomes consolidated in the 2000s, because the system creates its own mechanisms for dealing with conflict. And so contestation, in as far as it exists, is very well managed by the system.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Paul said. Since we wrote this together, I agree with everything he said. We did try and develop a concept called normal contestation, right? And what we were thinking about this, comparing it, let's say, to Western democratic capitalist countries, in which people don't necessarily want to overthrow democracy in the market, or haven't until recently, maybe. But there's lots of disagreement. And the disagreement is based in the different interests that we've got in society, the different ways in which we're organized. And of course, they're politicized by political parties. Right? So it operates within the system, and people disagree in a democratic manner. Now, we wondered whether there was kind of normal contestation possible within this hybrid political economy. That is to say, it wouldn't be about whether you like this system or not. It'd be people could still disagree about things. And what we found is that there is evidence of, we might call, normal contestation, but it isn't very intense, and it isn't generally very socially rooted. So in general, if you do analysis of public opinion in Western countries, you'll find that issues like, support for abortion is very strongly affected by religion. We don't find this to be the case in the Russian context. All sorts of ways in which contestation exists, normal contestation exists, but it's really constrained. And part of the reason it's constrained is because the way in which this hybrid political economy works. It works effectively so long as it operates within its own boundaries to limit contestation, and it stops it being about the system as a whole. And that's really what it had seemed to have achieved, and that's what it seems to have blown, if you like, right, by other sorts of things that the regime itself decided to do.
I guess my follow-up on this is, how did that happen? Right? Is this a intentional thing where someone's saying, we're going to do the facade of democracy, but we're really going to have authoritarian? Is there an intentionality behind this, whether from Putin himself or the Russian Federation? Is this something that was orchestrated to do it this way because this is what the Russian way is, or this is how it's going to work? Is there an intentionality behind this?
That's a good
question. I don't know if we do agree on this, Stephen. This is an interesting question. This is an interesting question. I mean, there are, within the literature on Russian politics, there are some people who say that the rule book wasn't written by Putin. It wasn't written by Yeltsin either. It was actually written by Gorbachev. Gorbachev was the first faker of democracy. and Yeltsin and Putin have just sort of adapted and revised this over time. Certainly many of the so-called reforms that Putin introduces in the early 2000s, which re-established what he called the power vertical, they were reforms that Yeltsin had tried to introduce, or they were political changes that Yeltsin tried to introduce. But he failed for lots of reasons, but mainly because he just did not have the political authority that Putin was able to acquire in those early years. Also, let's not forget, Putin also benefited from the fact that oil prices went through the roof in the early 2000s. So he had the rents to build the base of authority that Yeltsin didn't have. How far do we go back into Russian history to see who wrote the rule book?
I think, yes.
Disagree with him here, Stephen. Where's the disagreement?
Of course, I'm not going to disagree. No, I don't. I don't really think that Gorbachev to Putin comparison goes all that far.
Mm.
I would say you have to go back to how the difficulties and multiple dimensions that Russian people and the Russian elites felt in the 1990s. It wasn't just about the economy. It wasn't just about the fact that as it were, there was no ruling party that could establish itself until Putin came along. It's also that there was internal conflict within the Russian Federation. We can't forget about how important Chechnya was, right? And the use of extreme force by Putin to reassert central control over the regions, right? I think we also shouldn't forget, because it's important, that, as it were, Putin comes from the KGB.
Right.
As it were, the KGB, I think we can say, was one of the institutions that was least damaged as it transited out of communism. It probably retained its structures better than others. There were people who were calling for a kind of authoritarian approach to the transition, even in the late Gorbachev period. And I think we can see a kind of continuity of some sources of power that had then the capacity to bring together other sorts of elites and then use that power quite ruthlessly to reassert central control in all sorts of ways, including, remember, in the 1990s, people were talking about Russia as being a kind of oligarchy, but the biggest and most powerful players were the oligarchs. Well, that was very relatively quickly disabused by Putin and the United Russia and the new establishment in the 2000s, when it was clear where power lay, and that if you wanted anything done, you had to operate through those power mechanisms. The Russian people at the same time, having had this experience of extreme chaos, really, politically, economically, and in terms of national frontiers, and indeed war within the territory, were open to seeing some sort of order being restored and for the economy to improve. Oil prices made a big difference to this. So there's an opening there, right? But to come back again, they never turn around and say, we're abandoning democracy and the market. We are just making it work in a particular way, and in which we can ensure that there's some, for example, they start paying wages and pensions. 1990s are characterized by people not getting paid, right? So some degree of economic order is clearly restored in the Putin 2000s period. I think this is what creates the basis for it, and gives a kind of some understanding of how Putin is able to succeed. But the old structures of power are important here as well.
Yeah, that makes a lot. That makes a lot of sense, actually. So let's talk a little bit about methods, because this will be very important. The thing that I think is most instructive here is not necessarily. I mean, it's important, but there is a difference between Putin and the Russian political authority and the elites and Russian people. Of course, Russian people are not going to all agree on things, whether they say so or not, whether they can say so or not. But this book is, again, it's how Russians understand the new Russia. I'm sure some people are wondering, how did you collect data from public opinion data from the Russian people, and how much can we hold the veracity of the statements, how authoritative it is? Is there anything that's missing? Is there anything that's being not withheld, or people aren't saying anything? What were the ways in which you both collected public information from and on Russian citizens about their public opinions? I'll just say, most people know that Russia is not kind to dissidents. Russia is not kind to journalists. Russia is not kind to, meaning the Russian political system. They're not kind to people that disagree necessarily very publicly. How did you get the information from the public, and how do you trust the kind of the statements that are made if there's any disagreement or anything against the administration.
Okay, so we do things, and we did things starting in 1993 in a fairly standard way, using what we think are the best standards for public opinion polling. So we do nationally representative samples. We try and measure response rates. And early on in this, when we're starting these surveys, we did things like we retested people, a subsample of our participants, to see how stable their responses were, just to see whether they were saying the same things in ways over time. And we found that there was quite a lot of stability in the responses, appropriate levels of response in the responses. I think our biggest, as it were, rejoinder to that challenge would be to say, isn't it interesting how critical Russians were of many things in practice over the entire period of time? And not only that, maybe most crucially, criticism of the system in practice increases rather than decreases as the system becomes more authoritarian. Right? Now, you can ask, how is that possible? Well, I guess we would say that first we have to ensure that our respondents feel appropriately secure that their responses are anonymized, right? We take a lot of care to make sure that happens, quite rightly. But I think there may be something else underpinning it, which is that Russians, for the most part, have a strong kind of normative commitment to things like free speech.
You can see that in the polling that's being done at the moment.
Absolutely.
I mean, consistently, despite everything that has gone on in Russia since 2022, and the risks that people are taking when they talk about the war, consistently, Russian polling agencies find that between 20-30% of their respondents oppose the war.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's not, though, that we think that we're hitting it absolutely spot on, right? So maybe there is some underestimate of criticism, although other methods that are used that try and get people to feel completely confidential in expressing their opinions about things don't suggest that there is an enormous amount of preference falsification even in the current period, right? So there's something that Russians feel able to speak. Now, it may be that now speaking in public clearly about certain issues is clearly going to be very dangerous, and which is why asking people direct questions now, if we could, about their stances on the war, maybe we would feel we'd have to come at that in a much more roundabout way to ensure that we're getting better feedback. But the key thing is we find loads of criticism of the regime, and criticism growing as the regime becomes more authoritarian. It doesn't clearly dampen open through surveys responses to our questions. And that's why we think we've got a lot of faith in our data.
Javier, do you know who the main consumer of polling data is in Russia?
I don't actually.
The state.
Yeah, that was what I was. My intuition says this. Yes,
is the main source of income for polling companies, and it's the best way for the authorities to find out what is going on within their society, despite all the limitations of polling that Stephen has described. They invest a vast amount into polling. So, there are lots of established polling companies in Russia that have
and this is where you guys are pulling from. You're pulling from these sources.
Yeah, that have been running surveys since the early 1990s.
One thing just to add is that as we know from polls in the United States and in Britain and so on, polling gets harder, right? And it gets harder in part because they're harder to be representative because so many people refuse. One of the things that we found just that changed over time is that whereas we were getting response rates of like 90% early on, right? People were just desperate, right, to participate in a survey. One of the biggest effects on response rates was when people because we were doing it face to face, we were sending people round, knocking on people's doors, was when people became frightened to open their doors because they feared crime.
Mm-hmm.
This happened in the late 1990s, right? So it's always a challenge to do polling, but I don't think the challenges are greater necessarily in Russia than they are, as we're finding in many, many established democracies these days. You mentioned something, Xavier, about generations.
Yeah.
I think it's really interesting. Yeah. It's one of the things that we find becomes, especially after 2014, becomes more important. Right? So it's this, as you kind of mentioned earlier, it's, did you have experience of living in the Soviet Union as something like an adult? Right? And the effects of what we think is really key and interesting in our book is that after 2014, the number of people in our responses, among our respondents, who say, I identify more with the Soviet Union than I do with Russia, right? And that number had been declining from 1993, as you would expect.
Sure.
After 2014, it shoots up again.
Really?
Shoots. So there are now more people, or at least in our last survey, more people in 2021 who identify more with the Soviet Union than with Russia, right? It's back to the sort of levels that there were there in 1993.
Why do we think this is? That's very surprising to me.
It's because we think, and it has real consequences that we think are really interesting. It's because first, after 2014, they have expansionist policies. Second, they try and bring on board the communist past, right? And the idea that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a disaster. So they're no longer committed to say, we're building a new Russian democratic nation state. It's what went wrong with the Soviet Union and it disappearing. And so they trigger a response in the identities of Russian citizens that reinvigorates a Soviet identity.
What you get in the data as well, Stephen, sorry, just to interrupt on that. What's really interesting is that the effect that Stephen is describing is constant across all of the age cohorts that experience communism. Those age cohorts that didn't experience communism, we see no increase in Soviet identity amongst those. Yeah, so the sort of, if you like, the supply side emphasis on the sort of communist past, on Soviet identity, all this messaging that you're getting from the regime from the late sort of 2000s onwards, this resonates with people who grew up during communism. So they don't, they'd have been primed by their historical past to be more receptive to this appeal.
And the young people who were born after the collapse of the Soviet Union don't get it.
They don't get it. But
so there's a huge schism now, right? There was a huge schism that's generational that really wasn't there until this Soviet identity was reinvigorated.
But Steve, there's still not the supply side opportunities for those people to express those views. So what tends to happen is that it manifests as apathy, actually. So in polling, they express their identification with the Russian Federation. They express a greater willingness to protest than older citizens. They express their dissatisfaction with the political system. But when it comes to actually doing anything about it, they don't. Right?
Or they leave.
Yeah.
Right.
if people can see my look on my face, I'm very, very puzzled. And so that's Very, very fascinating. Okay.
So we did.
What-
So we've got some very interesting results on sanctions, for example.
Okay, go ahead.
How Russians respond to sanctions. So
Uh-huh.
there's a generational divide. Younger Russians are more likely to be concerned about sanctions than older generations are.
Yeah.
Younger Russians are also more likely to protest than older Russians are. But are younger Russians who are concerned about sanctions more likely to protest? No. These two things don't interact.
Yeah.
And this goes back to what we were saying earlier about the effectiveness of the regime in depoliticizing the population. Yeah. This is one manifestation of that.
You've got to also just add now that after 2022, and I think this is a kind of conclusion of our book, is that this stops being a hybrid regime by this point, right? In the sense that we were talking about. It's become an out-and-out authoritarian regime. There's still some absolute facade, right, of elections, but everybody knows now that this is a facade. It's an out-and-out authoritarian regime, which is also, in terms of the way in which the economy is governed, essentially state-run war, a kind of war machine now. Right? So the hybridity is ended, but this means it's actually genuinely frightening for people to protest openly.
Yeah,
of course. Okay, let me touch on a few things here. I guess what? Okay, if I'm living in Russia, and let's say around Moscow or St. Petersburg, we're not saying any of the territories out, in Siberia. Let's say around kind of, where the major hubs are. And I look out into the world. I have social media, right? Whether it's some censored or filtered or not, but I have social media. I can look out in the world. I can look across and see, what Finland's doing. I can see what, Europe is doing, East and West. I can look at what the United States is doing, what Asia's doing, or rather, deeper into Asia. And why are so, from what it sounds like from polling here, are many Russians saying, yeah, what I'm being told and what I'm being fed and what I'm being, really the messaging, or if you want to, stronger propaganda that's being told to me from the state, I like that. That makes sense. Yes, we're going to keep this. Is there something about, the whole thing about identity with Soviet Union? Is it something where, Russia is so removed, in a sense, from the rest of the world, in a sense, right? It literally is very far from a lot of places. Your neighbors are very small former Soviet Union countries, or very large, more, kind of Central Eurasian, the former steppe countries, which, don't really pose a major threat to you necessarily. And that's it. And then you sort of are kind of isolated. You have this long history from Russia, long, deep history of might and power and all these things, of empire. Is it just one of those things where it's like, yeah, we don't connect with the rest of the world in this way? The West and all their nonsense, we don't connect with that. We have strength, we have might, people don't take us serious. So we like this messaging that says, hey, you remember this time? Remember when we were a force? Remember when this is there something to that? Because I can't think of any reason why people would want to further, again, and I'm not trying to say that there's an alternative, I'm not saying the US does it better or the United Kingdom does it. I'm not saying that they want to run into the arms of some other system. But from the system they have, they're going to believe this messaging at the very least that's convincing, that now this identity of, former USSR is, the ideal standard, or there's some identity there that makes more sense. I'm trying to understand, if I'm a Russian citizen, what the buy-in is for economically, politically, on social issues, any of these things. Why again, before 22, why was there this kind of ingestation of these ideas and this messaging? I'm trying to understand that mindset.
I mean, what we find in the surveys is that there is a significant growth in anti-Western attitudes over time. In fact, it doubles in our survey responses. So that is very interesting, given the question that you've just posed, Javier. Is it to do with isolation? No, because during this period, of course, Russia is very much integrated into the rest of the world. It's not like the Soviet period when only very few people could travel overseas. Russians travel, they're educated overseas, they have access to a wide variety of media. In recent years, the state has learned how to deal with social media in a much more effective way.
Doesn't that make it almost worse? Because if you're behind the wall, right, so to speak, and you're not exposed, and you're like, we're going to have it this way. But you're saying Russians are traveling, their access to social media, and they're seeing all these things from the West, and they're saying, nope, I don't want that. I'm not buying that. I like what I have at home.
When you say Russians, I mean, we do need to then sort of disaggregate this this mass and look at who is more susceptible to anti-Western appeals. I mean, there is an element of make Russia great again.
I could see that.
That appeal is powerful, and it resonates with certain constituencies.
Yeah.
So, what we find in the book, and going back to this point about contestation. So, why do differences exist on certain policy questions? Well, if we look at foreign policy and we look at the differences on foreign policy, what explains the stances that Russians take on foreign policy questions is things like, are they socially conservative or not? Do they believe that the state ought to have greater control over the economy or not? So there are elements within sort of Russian political culture, which, and this has evolved over a very long period of time, which makes that society or certain segments of it much more sort of receptive to these attitudes. I mean, younger people are less isolationist. They still, polling to this day still shows that they're more likely to be opposed to the war. They're more likely to be opposed to sort of regime anti-Western messaging. And that may be a consequence of social media and the things that you're talking about, Javier. But, there's a big chunk of that society that operates according to a very different value system, which is partly a product of their Soviet past, and also the media that they consume.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's right. So just on the media, we should...
Sure.
First, Russian state media is highly controlled, and most people get their news and information from state television, right? Also, and I know Paul is supervising someone who's doing a lot of really interesting work on just how the Russian state engages with social media. It doesn't, unlike the Chinese, it hasn't tried to put up a barrier, right? But what it does is it's extremely actively involved in trying to manipulate opinion online. So it has its own responses. So there's the mechanics of how you might keep people on board. There's also just the straightforward plausibility of the story, which is they lost the Cold War. They were then completely screwed. by the West, right? Economically and politically, they were humiliated in various ways. And it seems as though this was never going to end. And NATO and the West were pushing up against the very borders. Right. So if we go back to 2011 and 2012, the mass protests against electoral fraud, the regime quite effectively pushed to say this was organized by the West. When there's opposition and support for integration of Ukraine, among most Ukrainians, of course, organized by the West. So the West as scapegoat to explain the humiliation that many Russians feel about what has happened, not only to them individually, but to their sense of status in the world, is a phenomenally strong resource that this regime can call on and integrate into its platform in various ways. And it's not, as Paul alluded to, it's not just Russia that may feel a sense of national humiliation, that some politicians claim that they're able to rectify. Make America great again. God knows the horrors of the interwar period in other parts of Europe, right? Show how powerful this sort of political appeal can be to many people. And unfortunately, I think that the regime in Russia has decided to play that for all it's worth. How you get back from there, right, is yet another horrifically complicated question, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question, right? The big question here is, how do you, this is scaled upwards. There's this interesting phenomena, which has been fascinating for me, of around the world, different shades of authoritarianism have taken hold and have a lot of ground that they've laid, and there's a staying power, which is interesting, and it looks different. What it looks like in China is different than what it looks like in Russia, than what it looks like in Israel, than what it looks like in Turkey and Hungary, here in the United States. It's all a little different, but there's things that make it kind of connected. So it's very interesting to see that many citizens of the world have a lot of appeal. There's a lot of appeal for that for many people, and each country does a little different. So I want to get on to the war a little bit. You do mention it obviously in the book. Before we get there, two things I guess I want to talk about. So we've been talking about this hybrid system, which seems to be this sort of facade of democracy, or respondents in polling saying they want these things or they don't want these things, but then there's not a lot of practice behind it, and that there is a sort of authoritarian piece. So this kind of this hybrid you guys have been talking about. You talk about these three stances: the system consolidators, anti-system market Democrats, and statist authoritarians. Maybe chat about those briefly, and show us, I guess, how this plays out when people go to the voting booth, right? What elections look like in Russia. How legitimate they are, or they aren't, etc. So maybe talk about these three types, and then kind of get us to how people vote.
Yeah, so what we do in the book is to use two questions actually four questions, two on the political system, two on the economy, and we combine them to sort of place our respondents in predominantly three categories. Yeah, that's how it sort of falls out in the analysis. There are essentially three categories that Russians fall into. They're either system consolidators, and by that we mean respondents who accept this sort of normative commitment or alleged normative commitment to democracy in the market and support how democracy in the market exist in practice. Then we've got another group, which I think people in the West are likely to expect. These are people who normatively agree with democracy and the market, but are opposed to the way that it operates in practice in Russia. We call these the sort of anti-system market Democrats. And then we've got a really interesting group of those people who believe that the system that has come into being in Russia since the early 2000s is not authoritarian or statist enough, right? So these are people who are opposed to democracy and the market in theory and how it operates in practice in Russia. Generally speaking, what we see is that over time, system supporters increase and anti-system market Democrats and statist authoritarians decline. And then in 2014, this trend sort of stalls, and then we see a reversal. So we see a revival of anti-system market Democrats and anti-system authoritarians. Now, electorally, what this means is that for a long time, especially during the 2000s, Putin and his party, United Russia, were very effective in capturing all of these different constituencies. So if we look at support, the party support and the presidential support of anti-system and pro-system constituencies, it's primarily sort of captured by United Russia, Putin's party, and Putin at elections. But then towards the end of our time of analysis, we see a revival in the support of anti-system opponents to the regime for the opposition. And we're only talking about the official opposition here, not the anti-system opposition. So the Communist Party does appear to pick up quite a lot of support by 2022 of sort of disaffected voters. So that's the general pattern.
So I think, just to add, of course, we know that there are real restrictions in the Russian electoral system about even getting on the ballot, right? So they're quite effective at keeping certain groups, individuals, Navalny, others, prevented from running, right? So they're pretty organized about doing that. The other thing I think to bear in mind is that there's an absent field, as it were, lots of absences, but there's an absent field starting from the mid-2000s in which the quote-unquote, the liberal democratic opposition doesn't get on the ballot either. And part of the reason it doesn't get on the ballot is because of restrictions, but it's also just because the base of support narrows very considerably for that group in that time. And their supporters tend to go, if they vote, they tend to go for Putin. So we have to remember that, oddly, perhaps, Putin is not the out-and-out authoritarian in this period of time, right? And that's not quite what his appeal is. And in fact, if you're sitting in Russia, and this is something that we have said in a number of publications, if you're sitting in Russia, you might think to yourself, look, we've got these two choices on these two extremes. We can go for out-and-out authoritarianism, or we can go for liberal democracy. And between those two, you find that there's kind of chaos. And where are you looking for? You're looking at, I don't know, maybe you're looking at Ukraine as much as the West, and you're thinking, well, look at all the political upheaval there is there, and the sense of crisis and stress that there is involved in that. So there's a kind of stability, so long as Putin retains this notion that he is broadly in favor of not screwing around entirely with the normative underpinnings of what people are supported in this period of time. And chaos is an alternative, and the chaos of the 1990s is also a relevant experience for people to think about what the choices are now. Now, again, coming back to the appeal of Putin changes, and the base of support for Putin changes over time. One of the fascinating things we found is that in the 2000s, Putin supporters were clearly more likely to identify with Russia than with the Soviet Union. Right? Support for the Soviet Union went mainly to the communists. Right? And basically, he's a kind of modernizer. Medvedev is kind of the same modernizer. We're trying to build a Russian nation state that has this quote-unquote normative foundation of democracy in the market, even if our practices are different. What happens, I think it emerges by 2018, is that Putin's base of support is now more from people who identify with the Soviet Union than with Russia. In other words, he has shifted his nature, his appeal in a much more authoritarian direction. Now, what are the Liberal Democrats still can't get on the ballot, right? They're still excluded, right? What do they do? Where do they go? And this is why one of the most important, I think, chapters in our book is actually the analysis of people who don't vote, right? So people don't vote for all sorts of reasons in every country, whether there are elections. But we do find that some of this support or opposition to the regime from the Liberal Democratic side comes from people who are disaffected with how the system is working, but who are also liberal or market Democrats, if you like, right? But translating that into something that looks like effective action is extremely difficult. You spoke about comparative authoritarianism or electoral authoritarianism. Comparatively, we know that elections are really dangerous points for electoral authoritarian regimes under some circumstances because they go through the pretense of having them, but sometimes they can be tricky. And the regime really doesn't want to lose or even be seen to be committing too much fraud to win elections, right? At the moment, at least, the notion that there's going to be an electoral crisis for this regime, I believe it's now currently fanciful. But the question we have to ask as well is, if not a commitment to hybridity, that is, broadly speaking, democracy and the market are fine. We want it, but we're just going to control it. What are the alternative ways in which authoritarianism these days can legitimate itself in public opinion, right? Can they come out and say, no, we're totally against the whole idea of democracy in the market. We're just going to run things as if it was the Soviet Union, right? Or as if it's a technocracy or something, only smart people or only oligarchs can run things. I think there's a real problem of finding alternative ways of legitimating authoritarianism today. And, it's not going to be, some kind of Iran where it's going to be run by mullahs, right? They've got to find a way of legitimate. And I think they have got, my view, Paul may or may not agree, we may not agree on this, is the regime has isolated itself and it doesn't now clearly know how it's going to legitimate itself again, which means it's going to have to rule by force and fear. Do you agree, Paul?
I do agree. I do agree. It's not just force and fear, though. The war has provided an opportunity for the state to firstly to redistribute a hell of a lot of property. And so the state's control has increased, and it's spread its sort of support base within the elite by redistributing sort of property during the war. But more importantly, it is investing huge amounts into the Russian social economy. So the standard of living is actually improving in Russia. So income levels have have improved since the war started.
Mm.
So that also gives the regime a sort of a base of support. So far, at least, the economic consequences of the war do not appear to have impacted on the state's ability to deliver for its core support, i.e., those sort of Russians who are reliant on the state for handouts. So, I mean, Russia historically has, faced this sort of paradox. On the one hand, Russian leaders tactically are very good. Strategically, they're not very good. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So tactically, the war has created lots of opportunities for this sort of regime to reinflate its support. But where it goes sort of long term is not clear at all.
Mm-hmm.
As Stephen said, how do you go back to a sort of a modernizing appeal when you can't sort of root that in the modern era in some, even if it's just rhetorical commitment to democracy and the market.
Mm.
It's very, you can't do it on a sort of a war economy footing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And let me ask you the kind of last kind of topic here I want to just bring up is it's about the war. So obviously most people place the start of the war with the annexation of Crimea 2014, and then there was the invasion in 2022. But many people have said the start of the war was 2014. Either way, 2022, the invasion into Ukraine. It's been 3 years. I guess there's two questions I want to ask on this specifically, which I think is the question most people are most curious about is, look, what Putin's motivations are. He was in COVID, he was, locked up, he just, planned the war games and drew it up and said, okay, boom, here's my time. I've heard that theory. I've heard, this is the long game, whatever. I don't think anyone's going to really know the mind of Putin. I guess the question I have is twofold. How much, you talk about this in the book, so how much, and we've talked about it here a bit, how much is national identity central here, right? And you talked about this kind of renaissance to, Soviet Union kind of identity. But in terms of what it means to be Russian or this identity, I've heard the propaganda that Putin has said about, he goes back to the 10th century and why Ukraine is really right. I've heard his whole spiel on this. But this theme of identity for Russia and how that's connected with Ukraine, and of course there is overlap throughout their history, of course, but in terms of having a shared history. But how do Russians do or do not have steady support? In one sense, some people will say, well, I mean, look at you Americans. You were 20 years in Afghanistan. You guys didn't really raise that much hell. You guys, you were in Iraq for, 15 years. Like, you guys didn't, people did make a lot of noise about it, but, there wasn't a mutiny. They didn't go to the White House and pull the president out, so what's so different, right? And, again, I mean, obviously these are different conflicts, but what is the support that Putin has for this war in Ukraine 3 years on? Or since the invasion, I should say. And how is it or is it not tied to the identity that that Russians buy this story or this meme of this is really Russian land, these are really Russian people, Kiev is rightfully ours anyways. Like, how much of that are people saying, yep, I like that story, that makes sense, I agree with it, we'll support you to the end, whatever it takes? Or, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of difference here, but whether people verbalize that publicly or not is another story. But yeah, what is this idea of identity and the public support for the war or the war in Ukraine?
Russia faces a huge stateless problem, what political scientists call a stateless problem, which has plagued that society for centuries. There's a lack of either at the elite level or at the mass level, lack of a consensus on what sort of constitutes the boundaries of the Russian state. And there's also a sort of a divide over, what sort of constitutes a Russian.
Yeah.
And, so there are these two dimensions which, the Russian state, Russia's post-Soviet rulers failed to come to terms with. Yeah. I think what we try and show in our book is that the Russian Federation as a project failed. Yeah. It failed. It failed to create a social sort of basis of support. Yeah, there was an attempt during the Yeltsin years to create a civic identity around the Russian Federation. That failed to sort of galvanize mass support, and so the regime moved in a more ethnic direction. But defining the Russian nation in terms of ethnicity is extremely dangerous in a country where you have so many different ethnic groups. And so what the regime ultimately falls back on is sort of its imperial identity. Yeah. Russia historically developed as an empire, not as a sort of a nation state. The Russian Federation is the first attempt to create a Russian nation state. But it lacks it lacked a sort of social basis of support. And so when Putin, after 2012, tries to reflate the authority of the regime, because it can no longer go back to economic success and growth as the basis for its authority, that crashes in 2008, 2009. It rediscovers this sort of imperial identity. So it goes back to sort of imperialism. And the main victim of this, of course, is Ukraine. So yes, I mean the Ukrainian war is connected to Russia's stateless problem in a big way, in a very tragic and destructive way.
Yeah, I completely agree, Paul. Very well put, actually. And I'll just add one thing, right, which is how surprising it can be to us to find what are otherwise what we might think of as very liberal Russians who share the view that there isn't such a real thing as Ukraine, right? And that somehow their territory and that connection to that territory was stolen from them on the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the difficulty that many people in Russia have, even liberal people have, in understanding what it is to be Ukrainian, I think provides another source of support for the regime and inhibits the development of what we might think of as a Russian identity based upon this current territory. It's a deep, deep problem that I think, I thought you were going to ask at some point, how are we ever going to get out of this? Right? And of course, it seems as though Trump is not solving it on day one or day 10.
No, surprise.
Where are we going to be? Where are we going to be? How are we going to get out of this? And that probably goes way beyond our book. Maybe our book says it's going to be tricky, very difficult, and it's going to take great statesmanship, both from Western countries, but also hopefully from leaders within Russia that can emerge, that can find a way of resolving this stateless problem on Russian territory.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's really my final question. I did not necessarily with Ukraine per se, but of course, that's involved. But yeah, the final question is what do you think a post-Putin Russia looks like economically, politically, and socially? I mean, it's a big question, but what do you? He's not going to live forever,
Yeah.
or B, people might, kind of say, okay, we've had enough. So no one's forever. So yeah, what do you think? You have 25 years of this guy. What do you have? What do you think post-Putin Russia looks like?
Well, he doesn't show any sign of throwing in the towel. I suppose it depends how long he goes on for. If post-Putin Russia starts in 5 years' time, then I think it's likely to look very similar to present-day Russia. And I say that because the structure of the system has changed as a result of the war, and undoing that is going to be extremely difficult, not least because the Russian military has been hit very hard by this conflict, and it's going to take a long time for them to rebuild their sort of capacity. And so this sort of militaristic system that has been created by the war is inevitably going to continue. It also provides the basis for economic sort of dynamism within that system. So without a very major sort of shift in the sort of international situation and a reintegration of Russia economically into the global economy, I don't see how it can evolve into anything else in the short term. What happens longer than that, though, goes back to what Stephen was saying before about the big problem facing modern authoritarian systems, and that is that they don't have many alternative legitimating strategies to the ones that they have sort of developed in the sort of post Cold War world, which is around sort of hybridity. There isn't an alternative like the alternative that communism presented, for example. And this isn't, as Stephen said, Russia isn't going to emerge as a theocratic system. There isn't any basis for that in Russia.
So maybe the last thing is perhaps if Western countries, as the Soviet Union collapsed, people hadn't spent a lot of time in the West, but they had a phenomenally high opinion of it in many, many ways. Not everyone, right? Phenomenally high opinion of it. And then experience was pretty mixed, both individually and in terms of what happened to the country as a whole. So maybe some of the answer is going to be in ways in which some of the worst issues and divisive issues in Western democratic politics might be resolved such that the West becomes once again a much, much more attractive democratic market example, right? And then when political openings happen, as they inevitably will, because elites compete for power, right? And Putin won't last forever, there might be an opening in which something of a more Western-oriented, based upon what a functioning democratic West would look like, could be made much more politically appealing. So some of it may come down to us.
Well, exactly. So if the West gets its act together, maybe. The difference, Stephen, with the past, of course, is that there is an alternative further east that didn't exist before.
That's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah.
I think that's totally right. I mean, I think it's just what a lot of countries themselves are dealing with, but just more at a kind of geopolitical stage of you can't just be against somebody, especially if that somebody is giving you something, stability, economics, they're fighting for you, whatever. If you don't have an alternative, because people are going to be like, well, either there's no alternative or it sucks. And so it's like, okay, well, I don't love everything about this guy, but I know what it is. It's stable. It works, sort of. It's good enough. And so I agree. I think people need to really be pushing for more creativity and connecting where people genuinely are, just at a global level. Paul, Stephen, this was a absolutely fantastic conversation. I greatly enjoyed it. You both are so full of wisdom, and I greatly appreciate you giving me your time and energy. This was very, very, very great.
Xavier, thank you. Great to meet you. Great to talk.
Thanks, Xavier. Thanks for doing this so early in the morning in the US as well. We really appreciate it.
Happy coffee.
Thank you.
Thank you.